We've got more work to do when it comes to to this very dodgy fleet of dodgy ships that are, going around coming out of Russia with oil in them, with dodgy flags and so on. And I think that they're sanctions busting, and we've talked a good talk about doing something about the shadow fleet, but I think we probably need to be doing more than we are, and boarding some more.
4 years ago today, Russia launched its full-scale invasion of Ukraine. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky says Russia's President Vladimir Putin has failed to achieve his war goals, and that's clearly true. The Kremlin says the same thing of Ukraine, but of course this was a war launched by Russia. Ukraine's goal was to be left in peace. When the war started, Ukraine's military was believed to be no match for Russia. But the country's held its own, and it stands. The war is largely now in a stalemate. So how do Ukrainians feel today, 4 years on from the beginning of this conflict? We've got Vadym Prystaiko, the former Ukrainian ambassador to the UK, with us. Ambassador, thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Explain to me a bit how life has changed for Ukrainian people since that fateful day 4 years ago.
Your description was quite right, in a way that Ukrainians found themselves in such a horrible situation where most of us are still fighting in here, trying to survive, but some of us are now in European Union and somewhere else. Almost 8 million people went in immigration. So we sort of going through the same very painful experience of any nation, but very fortunately for 4 years, with the assistance of our partners and the help of our friends, we are not only surviving and not only managed to stop allegedly second biggest army in the world, but we actually live in a kind of normal life. Today, the whole day of sort of remembrances and trying to rethink what's been done wrong, what could be done better, and our plans for the next, and very unfortunately, next years of fighting.
So can I ask you whether you think that realistically you can ever go back to the control of the whole of the country of Ukraine, whether in the end there isn't going to have to be some deal that says, well, the Russian armed forces can control 90% of the Donbass region. We're going to have to accept de facto control. Maybe not de jure, but de facto control.
I know that this is something which has been discussed not only in London or any other foreign capital, but actually Ukraine. And Ukrainians going through this tragedy and losing their beloved ones and cities being destroyed are seriously thinking of what can be done, what a compromise could be reasonable to give him a chance, Putin a chance to stop the war. The biggest problem is that not many of us believe that he's actually looking for the peace in any composition. So we might want to give or to discuss or compromise. The problem is that he's not given up his hopes to control the whole Ukraine. And that's something Ukrainians are not going to give him.
Do you think that there'll ever come a point where he reaches the conclusion that he simply can't win fully the war that he's launched, and that he's ready to talk peace in the kind of terms that you think is reasonable for him to consider?
I truly believe, regardless of what he's bragging, the sanctions which have been put on him by the rest of the world, at least the democratic part of the world, they're working. Our army is doing their own sanctioning the 35,000 of them a month, and destroying some of the refineries back in Russian territory. So this sort of sanctions is very effective. We believe that by holding them down and the front lines, by living the way we live and then rebuilding ourselves as the corruption-free democratic society, which is not going easy, we will be a strange new sort of living for Ukrainians. But for 4 years we've been doing it, and we are quite capable of doing this even more.
Can I ask about domestic opinion of President Zelensky? He's seen by lots of people here as a war hero, and he certainly was at the beginning of the conflict in Ukraine. And I wonder now whether some of that has worn off, whether what gets to all politicians, I did in the middle of the war, to even to Winston Churchill, has now got to Zelensky, and there's a sort of time for a change feeling, which you always get in politics.
It's hard to say in a nation which is under martial law We have one big TV program which uniting all more or less all major TV stations. We have quite consolidated message for outside of the world, not because we've been forced, but we believe that is important at a time of war. So it's very difficult to understand what actually Ukrainians feel. But generally, Ukrainians, as many other nations in the world, always unhappy with their leadership, even if it is worth keeping up. So we, in our system, we quite rarely have somebody to be re-elected. Actually, in 30 years, just once president was re-elected. And I know, and many Ukrainians do remember, that President Zelensky told us that he was not going to run for the second term. But time passed by, and the war is going on, and he is a world leader, coming to the point when he's again offering his candidacy for the presidency. We are not sure when this politically window will be open, or if this will be open at all. But some people are getting sort of, urge to get back to the usual politics as we remember it 4 years ago.
Can I ask you, you've got an audience on this programme, I'm pretty sure, if I understood Times Radio listeners and Times readers well, are very sympathetic listeners, and they'll want to know from you what more it is that European leaders, in particular British leaders, can do to aid your efforts to resist this invasion.
Frankly speaking, first thing which comes to my mind is this money, Russian money, been frozen but not used. I know how difficult politics and economy back in London. As you know, I've been there for quite a while. I understand the day-to-day living, but I still don't understand why, instead of digging in the taxpayers' money, we can't use the Russian 300 billions being stored in European banks for the just purpose of rebuilding what they destroyed. This is one thing. The second one is a vague promise of sending the troops on the ground to help Ukraine to secure a future when the war is over. The big question is here, if we are planning it to do, why can't we do it right now when Ukraine just needs help to finish up this war, instead of going to very painful compromises which will not satisfy anybody and which might bring to this war to our continent again?
Well, that was Vadym Prystaiko, the former Ukrainian ambassador to the UK, on the 4th anniversary of Russia's invasion. Let's speak now to Emily Thornberry, the Labour MP and chair of the House of Commons Foreign Affairs Committee. Emily, thank you very much for joining me. Do you feel as though this war will ever end on terms that Ukraine can accept and which we can regard as a reasonable resolution to our resistance to the Russian invasion?
It all depends on the Russians, really, doesn't it? I mean, they've been battling away for now 4 years. Everybody thought that they were going to be, because they'd already, I mean, I'm sure people know, but they'd already grabbed a certain amount of Ukrainian territory in advance a few years before, and then they tried to push further. And people thought it'll be over in a few days. And 4 years later, 4 whole years later, they've only seized another 1.5% of Ukrainian territory. I mean, they are losing 35,000 people a month. It is a disaster. The Ukrainians are dug in, and we're at an important part of the war. But in the end, it's really up to the Russians what they want to do, because the Iranians are not going to give over their country. I mean, they have this kind of maximalist demands, don't they, the Russians, where they effectively just want Ukraine not to be a country anymore. So I presume because they want to wait until people aren't looking anymore and feel that they can then just grab the rest of Ukraine, and that's not going to happen. Yep. So, the pressure has to be, I think, on Russia, and I think we can see it's not going to be won on the battlefront. I think that the way to do it is by supporting the Ukrainians, of course, giving them the opportunity, giving them the resources so that they can defend particularly their civilians and their civilian infrastructure, but also to be able to fight back. But we need to continue to strangle the Russian economy. And I mean, we've heard today about the aid being given, but also 300 new sanctions being implemented by the British against Russia. We need to be doing it in conjunction with the Europeans. And we also need to make sure that those sanctions are actually implemented properly and that there's no getting around the sanctions. Yeah. So that does mean, I think, some pretty serious conversations, not just with the Indians, but with the Chinese when it comes to the Russians being able to export their oil.
So you and I have been involved in politics a long time, and you'll be aware of the story about Gordon Liddy, the Watergate conspirator, who put his hand over a flame until it started burning and then turned around and said the trick is not caring. So isn't the problem here that if 35,000 people die or some Russians can't get the goods that they would like to get, in the end Vladimir Putin is able to say, well, I don't care?
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's got much worse than a few people in Russia can't get the things that they want. I think that the economy is in deep trouble, and I mean, it's a war economy basically now, and people are not going to be able to get the basics, I think, as we continue to strangle their economy. It's a disaster for them economically, and I think this is the only way through, is to bring home to the Russians just how difficult life can get, and that they are a large country, but their whole economy can be affected by a serious sanctions regime. And what I was also going to say is, I think we've got more work to do when it comes to to this very dodgy fleet of dodgy ships that are, going around coming out of Russia with oil in them, with dodgy flags and so on. And I think that they're sanctions busting, and we've talked a good talk about doing something about the shadow fleet, but I think we probably need to be doing more than we are, and boarding some more.
Yeah, what might that be if we did more than we were doing?
So I think what we need to do is we need to board some more than we are. I think we've been involved in 2 boardings recently, but I think that there's more that can be done, and we've been doing it in conjunction with other countries. But I think that those that are, these ships that are clearly, many of them are just taking the mickey and obviously, in breach of international law, we need to be much firmer than we have been. And I think that there's work going on. I mean, obviously, you don't want to breach international law, I appreciate. And so work needs to be done in order to make sure that, when they're flying a particular flag, work has been done to make sure that we know that they are definitely not a ship from wherever, and then we can board them, and then we can seize the sanctions busting oil that they've got in there.
Well, thank you very much for your answers on that.